We as Catholics don't normally get into the practice of quoting scripture and verse at people like some other Christians do. So we don't go around going, well, as you see in Ezekiel 3:14 or, Romans 2:18 or anything like that. We don't normally do that. But there's one scripture verse that I think all Catholics should have ready to say to anyone, and that is today's gospel passage, Matthew 16:13-20. Because what we hear in the gospel today is the quintessential text that establishes the authority of the church, the Pope and the bishops in union with him. Now, some people, of course, will try to deny that, and they come up with all sorts of different reasons why they claim that, what Jesus was not really giving Peter the authority that we say passes down to Pope Leo XIV today. And in 2 weeks from now, in the Gospel and the Homily, we'll talk about refuting those arguments, and I can assure you they're very easy to refute. But while many of the people who are like that are the type that will tell us, you don't have to worry about looking at the original Greek or anything like that. What you see is what you get. Well, there are some scripture texts where you have to look at the original Greek and understand it in context. But this is not one of them. This is one of those ones where what you see is, in fact, what you get. But when they get to this, all of a sudden they start saying, well, if you look at the Greek and you see this and that, and try to put it into context, and they start using all the skills and tools that they accuse us of using and saying, you don't need that. Just read it, and what you see is there. Well, what you see here in this is exactly what you get. Jesus was, in fact, giving the authority to Peter to speak in his name for the rest of time, and that passes down right all the way to Pope Leo XIV. And in doing this, Jesus uses a pattern, a well-established pattern that we see in the Old Testament several different times of what happens when God changed somebody's name and gave them a commission. But we'll come back to that in a minute, because before we talk about that, we need to look a little bit, in order to fully understand the significance of this event, we need to look at the place where this took place. And the site of this was Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi was a pagan town. It was not a Jewish settlement. The Romans had settled it there. It's in the north of Israel in what's known as the Golan Heights, which had been part of Syria before the Israelis captured it again in one of their recent skirmishes over the years. And in this pagan town, the Romans performed pagan worship there. Now, in this spot, there was a cave, a huge cave that kind of looks like a jaw, like a set of jaws. And they called it the jaws of death, or the gates of the netherworld. And at this site, the Romans worshipped the god Pan, who was a part goat god and who was a fertility god. And they used to believe that during wintertime, the gods went into the netherworld, the underworld, and they stayed there, hibernating, kind of like bears would do. And so as a fertility religion, they believed when spring was ready to come, they had to go and perform rituals to awaken the gods from their slumber and come out and bring spring about. And of course, as a fertility cult, it had everything to do with all sexual activity and bringing new life. And it wasn't God's holy way of talking about bringing new life, but everything sordid and gross and disgusting that you can imagine. It was a bacchanalia like you could not believe. They performed temple prostitution and all sorts of other horrid and horrible lewd acts, and they called it religious. They claimed to be doing this in the name of the gods so that this was something good, totally distorting everything beautiful about the sexual gift and turning it into something sordid and filthy and claiming it was pleasing to the gods. And because Pan was a goat god, they even brought goats in and performed bestiality with them. Absolutely unimaginable. And the problem was that this was at that whole cave there was the headwaters of the Jordan River. The snows that melted from Mount Hermon would flow through that cave, and then from there it would go out and become the Jordan River. So this was the headwaters of the very lifeline of Israel. Without the Jordan River, they could not exist. And so at the place where their life was beginning with the Jordan River, pagans were performing these absolutely horrible activities. And the Jews were so repulsed by it, they found it such a defilement, such a desecration, that they would never even go near there. So with that, Jesus today takes the apostles into Caesarea Philippi. And they're probably wondering, why is he bringing us into this horrible place? And he brings them in and lets them see the place that they know very well what goes on there. and asks them the question he does today. Who do people say that I am? And they respond very easily. Oh, some think you're John the Baptist back from the dead, or Jeremiah, Elijah, one of the prophets. And he goes, oh yeah, that's great. But who do you say that I am? And you can almost hear the silence among the apostles, can't you? It's very easy to say what other people say. Who do you say that I am? And amid the silence, Simon speaks up and says, I say you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus approves of that. And there he goes into that classic formula that I mentioned that is well established in the Old Testament. And any good Jewish person would recognize clearly what Jesus was doing. There were several famous cases in the Old Testament of when God changed somebody's name. And there were key factors to it. First of all, it was always done in blessing, never cursing somebody, but always blessing them. God showed he had authority over them by changing their name, because in Jewish society, to give somebody a name showed you had authority over them. So Moses, for example, at the burning bush, when God says, I'm sending you to the people to let them go, he says to him, Lord, when I go to the people, what shall I say your name is? He's not going to even presume to try to give a name to God. No, I'm not going to give you a name. You tell me what your name is. In fact, even in culture today, we might do that to be correct. Somebody who's a superior, we might come up to them and say, how do you wish me to call you? So out of respect for them, we say, I'm not going to call you by a nickname or anything. You tell me what you'd like to be called. So changing the name showed God had authority over them. Then we find out the meaning of the name is very important. God enters a covenant with the person and gives him a commission. And so three famous ones we see. First of all, Noah. God changes his name from Noe to Noah. He says, no longer shall you be called Noe, but you shall be called Noah. And then he promises him, gives him the covenant that he will never again send the flood waters to destroy the earth, and puts the rainbow in the skies to show as his sign of that covenant. Another one, Abram. No longer shall you be called Abram, but you shall be called Abraham. And he enters a covenant with him in animal sacrifice, and then tells him that your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And most famously, no longer shall you be called Jacob, but you shall be called Israel, because you struggled with God and prevailed. And so we see there for the first time the meaning of the name. And that repeats itself many times in the Old Testament. So now here, when Simon says to Jesus, I say you are the Christ, the Messiah, Jesus turns to him and look what he says. He follows that very careful pattern. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. Here's the blessing. Because flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, meaning no other human being has told you that I'm the Messiah, but my Father in heaven. It's a sign from him that you are blessed by him. And so I declare to you, there's the authority of Jesus over Simon, you are Peter. He changes his name, and we hear the meaning of the name, rock, which literally is bedrock, a solid foundation, the type of solid rock you look for to build a building that's going to last. And then comes the covenant. And on this rock I will build my church, and the jaws of death, the power of the netherworld, will not prevail against it. In other words, everything they saw there, all of the errors of the Romans, all of the horrible abominations that they were passing off as something good and pleasing to God, I will not allow the church I build on you to sustain those errors, to teach anything that is wrong. I will give you the truth and guide you always. And then the commission. To you I give the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Keys are the authority. To give somebody the keys is the authority to open and to close, to let loose and to seal. And he says to him, if you declare something bound, it is held bound in heaven. And if you declare it loose on earth, it is loosed in heaven. In other words, Peter, you are the ultimate authority. When you speak definitively in my name, you speak for me. And he's giving him that promise that he will never allow him to sustain an error throughout all of time. Now, in 2 weeks from now in the gospel reading, we're going to see how Jesus extends that to the rest of the apostles as well. So it's the authority of the church, the Pope, and the bishops in union with them. But for now, he's giving it to Peter uniquely. And it is from that we talk about the infallibility of the Pope, that the Pope, under certain circumstances, can make an infallible statement. And there are very strict guidelines as to when he can do that. First, he has to be doing it as the recognized successor of St. Peter. Secondly, he has to be talking on a matter of faith and morals. He has to be speaking to all Catholics universally and intending to make an infallible statement. And in the course of the 2,000 years of the Church's history, popes have invoked that authority precisely twice, only twice. By Pius IX in the year 1854 to infallibly define the dogma of the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary, saying that from the moment Mary was conceived by St. Anne in her womb, so that no stain of sin would even remotely come near Christ, he privileged Mary to be conceived without original sin and preserved her from sin throughout her life, so Jesus would be born of a spotless virgin. That was the first time. The second in 1950 by Pope Pius XII to infallibly define the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, that at the conclusion of her earthly existence, so that no decay would touch the body that had borne Christ in the world, Mary was assumed body and soul into heaven. In other words, Mary is now risen and living in heaven the way you and I will be when Jesus returns in glory. That's it. All of the hullabaloo that people give us about the extraordinary infallibility of the Pope is about two definitions in 2,000 years. That doesn't mean, however, that those are the only two things we as Catholics have to believe. No, we are bound by the ordinary magisterium of the Church, the ordinary infallibility. And that, as I said, in 2 weeks, we'll talk about that authority. And that's the regular day-by-day teaching of the Church that binds us. And so when the Pope and the bishops with him clearly and consistently teach something in the course of time, we know it's the truth and we can count on it. Otherwise, we'd have to say Jesus lied to Peter because he allowed the Church to sustain a lie. Or we'd have to say he wasn't powerful enough to stop it, which of course is inconceivable. Now, we have to be careful to notice that we don't say, when the Pope we say he's infallible, we don't say he's impeccable. We don't say he can't make a mistake, or that any word out of the mouth of the Pope, that whatever he says is automatically gospel truth and an infallible truth. No, only under those certain circumstances. Popes can make mistakes. In fact, sometimes over history, popes have said things and probably later kind of regretted it a little bit. They were just shooting from the hip. They were not making formal statements. They were just saying things and maybe later said, maybe I should have worded that differently, rephrased it, and maybe they have to walk it back a little bit. But sometimes they do that, and sometimes even in giving a moral decision, a teaching on something, they are not automatically telling the truth or telling us the truth of God, revealing God's truth to us simply because somebody said it. For example, when the dance, the waltz, came about, the Pope at the time condemned the waltz as a sinful dance because it required the man to put his hand on the woman's waist as they were dancing. And that was too risque for him. And he says, no. He goes, that's sinful. You don't do that. But no Pope after that ever repeated it. And so it was never repeated by anyone else and clearly became a sign that that was not the Lord revealing an infallible teaching through him, but it was the opinion of that individual man. So we say that the more the Church repeats something, when it repeatedly becomes part of the Church's teaching and rises in the levels of authority in the Church, then we know we can trust it, that it is in fact the infallible teaching of Christ, because this is the authority he gave to Peter that passes down, right down to Pope Leo XIV. And so the highest authority we have is the Pope and the bishops in union with him. When they speak, we can listen with absolute certitude and know for sure that when the Church is teaching something that is a clear and consistent teaching of the Church, it is the truth, or else Jesus lied to Peter. And of course, we know he would never do that and could never do that. Now, of course, the problem comes in is that sometimes when the Church teaches something, we don't like it, and we wish it would be otherwise. And next Sunday, we'll talk about what to do when the clear teaching of the Church, where we're against it, and we don't think it's right. But for now, I think it's such a blessing that we have this authority that Jesus gave to the Pope and the bishops in union with him. Some people, when they talk about the authority of the Church, what we call the magisterium, they see it as, the Pope and those bishops, those old men in Rome who don't know anything about our lives, who's sitting there and just passing judgment on everything and passing power over us and just trying to control everything and manipulate us. This is their way of having power, by just pulling the strings so that we're like marionettes and they're controlling our entire lives. I see it as completely the opposite. I see it as the Lord freeing us from doubt, from any doubt as to whether or not something is true. Because there are so many different opinions out there, even among Christians. Any of the hot topic issues that we debate over and over again. You don't have to go far from here to find different Christian denominations who will teach anything that we teach as a sin is in fact okay and blessed by God. And sometimes people do that. They start looking for the person who tells them what they want to hear. Well, they go to this particular church because that one tells them that something the Catholic Church teaches is sinful is in fact okay. And so people go running after that. But the problem is, you can find different opinions in different churches being taught. And some people teach that God says that's a sin, and some people say it's holy. Well, it can't be both. It can't be both a sin and holy at the same time. So somebody is telling the truth, and other people are lying. Other people are telling people not what's the truth, but what the people want to hear, just so that they'll be popular with them and the people will come to them. And when people do that, when they follow one of these denominations and they go and they say, oh, I go to such and such a church because there the minister says this is okay and I can commit that act even though the Catholic Church says it's a sin. Well, when that person dies and stands before the Lord is going to say to them, I told you through my church that that was a sin. Why did you do it anyway? And if we try to respond, well, that minister in such and such a church told me it was okay, so I did it. The Lord's going to say, but why did you listen to that person and not to the church? I didn't send that person. They don't speak for me. They don't have my authority. I gave my authority to only one person, to Peter and his successors and the bishops in union with him. So why did you choose to reject the only authority I gave and listen to people who did not come with any credentials from me, who did not speak for me, but came speaking on their own authority? And you notice we are the only people, the only denomination of Christianity that can actually turn and say, we got our authority directly from the mouth of Jesus. That Jesus told Peter, to you I give the keys to the kingdom. Nobody else can say that. Anyone who breaks away from the church and speaks on their own, speaks precisely on their own, under their own authority, but not from the authority of God. And so, my brothers and sisters, it is such a blessing to us to know that when we listen to the Pope and the bishops, the magisterium of the church, we are listening to the truth. Many years ago, I remember I was at a wedding reception, and I was at table with the uncle of the bride, and this guy says to me, he goes, well, why do you think you have to parrot everything the Pope says? You have a brain, think for yourself. And I said to him, well, thank you very much for the compliment. You think I'm infallible? And he just looked at me and says, what do you mean? I said, you think I can never make a mistake? I said, you know what? I've made mistakes before. I've been wrong in the past, and I'll probably be wrong in the future. So if I love the people that are entrusted to my care, I'm not going to get up in the pulpit on Sunday and tell them to follow what I personally believe is the truth, because I might be wrong, and I might be misleading them and deceiving them, and in fact leading them away from Christ. And in fact, then if I have to do that, I teach something one Sunday, and then during the week I kind of think about it and say, maybe that really wasn't right. Maybe I should have thought that through a little more. And the next Sunday go to the people and say, what I told you last Sunday, well, I take it back. I realize that was wrong. I'm now telling you something different. Well, now I've lost all credibility, because now people would say, well, if you were wrong about that, how do we know you're right today? And how will we know you're right in anything else you say down the line? No, I said, but when I cut up in the pulpit and teach the clear and consistent teachings of the church that the church has taught for centuries, no matter how unpopular they are, I know I am speaking with the authority that Christ gave to Peter and his descendants, and I can say with certitude to the people, you must believe that, you must follow that, because it's not my opinion, it's the truth that Christ has taught the church through Peter and his descendants and the bishops in union with him, the successors of the apostles, and that he has promised to lead the church in truth through all of the generations. Because if we say the church has now changed the teaching, then we'd have to say for all these years beforehand, the church has been lying to us, and Christ allowed the church to sustain a lie, and that can never be. No, we have a great blessing to know that Christ has promised to lead us in truth through the clear teaching of the church. And when the church teaches the truth, you know you can follow it, because it's not the opinion of any individual, but it is the truth that Christ has revealed through his church. My friends, today, let us celebrate that. And sometimes I find Catholics when we start talking about the Pope and bishops, the authority of the church, they start feeling a little bit embarrassed, or maybe they have to apologize for it and start backpedaling a little. No, don't be embarrassed, don't apologize for the authority of the church. Be proud of it, be bold, profess it, and say, listen, we know we can say this with truth because Jesus promised Peter and his successors that he would always teach the truth through them, and we're teaching you that truth that the church has taught for 2,000 years. So you can believe it, and I can say it with certitude, because we are teaching you the truth that Christ promised to teach us through his church, the truth that indeed will set us free. May Jesus Christ be praised, now and forever.